Hi everyone, and thank you Rutgers University Press for allowing me this opportunity to share my work. My name is Simone Kolysh, and I am the author of Everyday Violence, the Public Harassment of Women and LGBTQ People. I'm going to set the book aside for a moment. I'm here to talk to you about the process that brought me here to this point, and I should mention that my training was in biology and public health prior to my completing a PhD in sociology, and when I entered the program, I was also teaching an Introduction to Women's Studies class at Brooklyn College, which is an incredible program and an incredible opportunity. And I wanted to talk about an experience that I, as a woman perceived individual, as a queer perceived individual on the streets of New York, was facing, which was the act of catcalling, which is, of course, a wide array of sexual harassment behavior that often cisgender and heterosexual men enact against people of other genders, but it is by no means unique to them. And so I wanted to study catcallers because I wanted to know why they do what they do and why they harass the way that they do, and do they think what they do is a problem. And I did a mini pilot ethnography with catcallers near New York University, and then I would randomly interview men who harassed me on the street and would record our interactions. And ultimately, this project developed into a much larger work, which is when I started to care a little bit less about what men thought and what they did and why they did it, and started to more seriously consider the impacts of things like catcalling and LGBTQ directed harassment on the people who receive these behaviors. And so I conducted an interview project, with 67 participants. I noted their oral histories, and I analyzed that data. Oh, my battery went a little low. Hopefully it'll last us through the end of this video. And so ultimately, I developed a very strong intersectional framework to analyze what takes place. And by intersectional framework, I mean to center an analysis of race, as well as gender and sexuality, class and space, and to center an analysis of institutions. And you may not think of the public sphere as an institution, but the way we want to address some of this is through criminalizing this behavior, through relying on police. And I might be one of the few people out there who does not want to solve sexual violence by relying on institutions that are inherently violent themselves. And so it's never the answer to have police officers support communities that they too historically abuse and have excluded from participating in public life. And as a queer person, I know that all too well. As a trans person, I know that all too well. The police are not on our side. And so in part, what I started realizing was that our experiences of being catcalled and of hearing slurs and of being assaulted are connected to this larger carceral state, and it's also connected to phenomena like gentrification. And so that's kind of how the book developed. And so just very briefly, I'll tell you that my introduction kind of puts forth my ideas around the way violence is addressed typically, and how I want to address it intersectionally, and the way I want to talk about it is linked to other institutional and other forms of violences, and to call catcalling a form of everyday violence, which is why the title is what it is. And then in chapter 1, I will talk specifically about the initiators of everyday violence, who we tend to blame for sexual violence and who we tend to excuse, but what is really taking place. And for that chapter, I analyzed 622 instances of harassment to try to start the anatomy of everyday violence, to lay out the model of everyday violence. In chapter 2, I summarize some of the data that I received from the recipients of everyday violence. And I talk about the short-term impacts, the long-term impacts, the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on, right? I talk about the impact on one's health and mental well-being, and the impact on one's embodied experience of urban life, and so on. And in chapter 3, I pay careful attention to the queer community, and I only focus on folks who are excluded due to their sexuality, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, and so on people, and try to think about how narratives of visibility and invisibility kind of work themselves out in public. And in chapter 2, I devote my attention to transgender and non-binary participants, because this is a community that I belong to, and it's also really important to disaggregate the T out of the LGBTQ. And so the chapter provides you with a lot more information about how something like everyday violence impacts transgender and non-binary people in ways that are distinct. In a chapter after that, I talk about race a little bit more, the intersection of racism, classism, and so on, and kind of talk about police brutality, gentrification, and how these neighborhood level processes impact these daily experiences and vice versa. And then I believe I just have a conclusion chapter in which I sort of talk about solutions that are out there and solutions that I believe we should be thinking about, and kind of future directions of this work. And I'm just so thrilled that Rutgers picked this up, because I tried to make it really short and readable and accessible, and a book that I think students will love and will see themselves in, and you can use it in all sorts of contexts, right? This is a book you could read as a human being to give you the terminology to explain your own life. You could teach it in a classroom and students will like it because it's readable, okay, because they'll see themselves in it. I had students read through every one of my chapters to make sure that it's flowing well, that it is manageable, that it is relatable, and of course you should give it to all the harassers in your life in order for them to understand how something they don't think makes a difference or enacts harm is actually a form of everyday violence. And I'd love to hear any and all of your thoughts and feedback. So find me at SimoneKolysh.com and contact me, or catch me on the Twitter streets at Simone Kolysh, where I'll be talking a lot more about this in the coming year. Thank you.